Hello, and welcome to a bonus box of Warhammer 40k's Grim History from the Beyond. I am Zeckthar, and today I will give chronicling of the Mezoan Campaign, as promised in our box, notable Alpha Legion characters. Like I said in that box, this campaign was far too large to do on our regular program, so here you have it, in all its glory. So sit back, put your feet up, and enjoy.
Now, the Mezoan Campaign, also referred to as the Third Siege of Mezoa, was a great battle fought in the opening years of the Horus Heresy. It marked the final concentrated effort of the traitor Warmaster Horus Lupercal's forces to seize control of the strategically important Mechanicum Forge world of Mezoa, the last star system still loyal to the Throne of Terra and the Gothic sector. Following the revelation of the Warmaster's true intent in the Estvon system, the worlds of the Coronoid Deeps were the first to suffer from the traitor's expansive efforts. Led by the Warmaster himself, the Sons of Horus quickly captured the heavily industrialized Manichaean Commonwealth in the short-lived Manichaean War. The Manichaean War came to an abrupt end through the events of the treachery at Port Ma, and the Warmaster captured a sizable Armada Imperialis naval fortress and orbital shipyard which would allow him to rearm and repair his fleets during the long march to Terra. By the end of 008.M31, only a few Imperial domains were spared the wrath of the traitor's armies. To the Galactic West, the isolated worlds of the Agathian domain were deemed too insignificant to squander valuable military resources on conquering it, while on the Cyclops clusters of the Forge world of Mezoa proved far too difficult a target to assail readily. As he had done before in the Great Crusade centuries before, Horus and the traitor's advance would circumvent Mezoa and blockade it until enough men and resources could be gathered to take the strategically important domain of the Mechanicum. While many worlds of this far-flung territories were deemed not valuable enough to offer any kind of coordinated resistance or threat, which at least in the case of the Agathian domain would prove to be a gross miscalculation, the Warmaster knew he could not ignore the powerful Mezoan Mechanicum. However, having challenged his father for the rule of the entire Imperium of mankind, Horus could not afford to be delayed in the Coronoid Deeps, but had to be seen on the front lines, leading new conquests and rallying new star systems to his banner. The task of eliminating the threat posed by the Loyalist Forge world would have to be handed down to other military commanders, belonging to the Warmaster's allies. Yet such a general could not be so readily found. Horus's own puppet ruler, Talok Thorn, the tyrant of Port Ma, lacked the military forces to both maintain productivity in the Manichaean Commonwealth and conduct a military campaign of the scale required to conquer the belligerent Forge world. Horus's principal ally in the region, the Dark Mechanicum Forge world of Cyclothrath, preferred to accomplish its own objectives rather than obey Thorn's orders. In truth, only the Forge world of Impandex, a long-time rival of Mezoa, showed any devotion to the Loyalist eradication. But long eclipsed by its rival, Impandex too lacked the military resources to vanquish Mezoa alone. Two previous attempts to seize Mezoa's principal forge fane had already been repelled, as the Mezoan Magi used their world's own volcanic might against the invaders, letting the ground collapse under the traitors' landing zones and rerouting lava streams to stall any advance or burn their enemies to ashes. Some of the most exotic reports of the earlier campaigns from the survivors even told of kilometer-long chunks of solidified magma, essentially man-made asteroids that had been flung as projectiles at oncoming enemy ships. The kinetic impact alone had been powerful enough to break a void ship in two. Words of Mezoa's continued defiance did not fail to reach Horus, and it is said that his wrath was terrifying to behold. Yet Horus's original plan to blockade Mezoa was having some effect, and when Horus deemed they had enough men at Port Ma, he ordered the invasion and destruction of the troublesome Mezoa. His order was so widely promulgated that several illuminated copies of this manuscript had survived to this day and are actually preserved in both the Imperial Archives of Terra and the Inquisitorial Archives of Tethys. The elimination of the threat posed by the Loyalist Forge world was a necessity. With his armies mustered for their final push towards the Segmentum Solar, the Warmaster could not allow any potential weaknesses in his rear, or risk exposing the traitor's vulnerable supply lines. Yet Horus had a problem. No matter how important the conquest of Mezoa was, every traitor commander present at Port Ma knew that victory would only be achieved at a tremendous cost in lives and material. As a result of Mezoa's tectonic instability, the powerful god engines of the Caliga Titanica could not be deployed, dramatically increasing the cost of taking the defiant Forge world. With much glory to be won in the oncoming wars, Horus's commanders were loath to weaken their forces at such an early juncture, yet none were so foolish as to openly refuse or ignore the will of the War Master. Knowing that Horus's eyes rested upon them, a silent war of influence erupted between the commanders of the traitor forces. Through veiled threats, outright lies, and a few fatal confrontations, the officers of the Arch-Traitors' armies each sought to see their mission assigned to one of their rivals. For solar weeks this bickering went on, until a very ambitious man showed up at the port, a man looking to get back in the good graces of Horus. This man's name was Consul Delegatus Aetolian Skor, commander of the 78th chapter of the Alpha Legion. Humbled by his defeat at the hands of the Shattered Legions during the siege of Epsilon Stranavar 9, the 78th chapter of the Alpha Legion and the depleted 114th Grand Battalion of the Iron Warriors arrived at Port Ma. In a desperate attempt to snatch up an important victory to balance the ledger of his recent defeat, Aetolian Skor took command of the Mezoan Campaign. In recognition of his rank, Skor was appointed as overall commander of the new task force and given access to Port Ma's vast stockpile of arms and materials. Even in the wake of his defeat on Stranavar, Aetolian Skor's ambition was undimmed. Being fully aware of the hostility borne for him by most of the command elements of the 114th Grand Battalion, Consul Delegata Skor used his new position of commanding officer of the Mezoan Task Force to appropriate the lion's share of the available resources for his own 78th chapter, leaving the Iron Warrior element under Nerek Dragur little chance to recover from their previous losses. With the bulk of the 4th Legion and their volatile lord, the Primarch Perturbo, deployed far away, Dragur's pleas for help or material fell on deaf ears, and other commanders seeing little interest or profit in aiding one they regarded as a failed officer. With no other choice left to them, Dragur and his Iron Warriors had to make what repairs they could and tend to their wounds, the resentment against Skor growing ever deeper. This is probably the first mistake Skor makes in the Mezoan campaign. Yet those of you that listen to my chronicling of Skor and the notable Alpha Legion characters know the answers to what his first mistake was. And throughout the Mezoan campaign, he will repeat this mistake again and again. He treats the Iron Warriors as second-class soldiers, plain and simple. Instead of spreading out the weapons of war and giving his siege breakers, aka the Iron Warriors of Dragur's 114th Grand Battalion, the weapons they needed to storm the fortifications, he doesn't really think of them as assets. Now, for those of you who don't know, the Iron Warriors were second to none when it came to siege warfare. The only group that came close was the Imperial Fists, and they were far better at building fortifications than tearing them down. Anyways, Skor led an impressive army composed of 12 capital-class warships, including a pair of fearsome Mangonel-class bombardment cruisers, 9,000 Legiones Astartes, 3 full Tagamata, those heretics from the Mechanicus, from the renegade forge world of Impandex, and 20,000 auxiliary troops. The Mezoa Task Force was one of the largest battle groups assigned to an independent command that was not under the control of a Primarch. Knowing that victory in this particular theater of war would ensure the favor of the War Master, Aetolian Skor began his preparations. Departing in good order, the fleet entered the warp. The Devonite lodge priests attached to the fleet's navigator contingent assured Skor that the passage would be swift and sure, and cleared of all storms. In a few short solar days, the fleet entered the Mezoa system, but they soon discovered that the Loyalists were more numerous than expected. As one of the few bastions of the Imperial resistance, the Forge world of Mezoa had been reinforced by splintered forces of the Shattered Legions, and even Loyalist survivors of the Armada Imperialis, which had been present at the treachery at Port Ma. While welcome, these reinforcements failed to considerably alter the balance of strength, until the arrival of one particular group, which was a little late to the party, yet they definitely made their presence known. We'll get to them later. The mighty Forge world, a glowing ember encircled by a dense ring of orbital defense stations and kill satellites, could not hope to match the traitors' numbers. Even worse, Aetolian Skor had learned his lesson from the fiasco at the siege of Epsilon Stranavar 9, and ensured that all of his void ship captains would obey his word, while the Loyalist command, even though united by a common goal, was still fractured. Nevertheless, the ragtag Loyalist fleet bravely opposed Skor's attempts to gain local space superiority. Soon, a chaotic void battle developed where the vessels of the Iron Warriors and Alpha Legion, numbering more heavy cruisers, started to gain their ascendancy. It was then that a new force emerged unheralded from the warp, the very edge of the Mezoan system. Unsure as which side the newly arrived ship would declare its allegiance, the battle ebbed. No new explosions illuminated the void as both sides turned their powerful augur banks towards the unidentified warship that emerged behind the traitors' battle line. Now, in this immense battle in space, nobody really knew what to do with this new craft, and every twitching hand was on a trigger to fire on the massive warship. Several tense solar seconds passed, while the ship's command crew tried to distinguish friend from foe. A period of time that could have seen the lone cruiser quickly crippled, had its arrival not plunged the traitors' fleet into total disarray. Coming in from the warp, the mighty Salamander's strike cruiser, called the Ebon Drake, unleashed its batteries at the closest traitor vessel, trying to maneuver its way to join the Loyalist fleet standing sentinel over Mezoa. This caused chaos within the traitor forces, allowing the Ebon Drake to break through the giant space battle and head towards the beleaguered world. Yet even with the arrival of the Ebon Drake, the Loyalists remained at a serious disadvantage in terms of both numbers and tonnage. But the Salamander's arrival had disrupted the enemy advance, and so the void battle raged on for more than 9 solar hours, both sides locked in a bloody stalemate. In the end, Score's unified command broke the balance, and the Loyalist fractionist nature caused some ships to retreat and thus leaving their allies unsupported. Rather than face annihilation, the combined Loyalist fleet had to abandon the orbital space around Mezoa, regrouping at the system's outer planets. Several vessels, amongst them the Ebon Drake, chose to dare the enemy fleet's guns one last time and close with the Forge world, risking being crippled to release landing craft and drop pods intended to reinforce the defenders on the ground. Of the half-dozen Legion and Armada Imperialis vessels to attempt the maneuver, only 3 rose again. The rest were annihilated by the traitors' guns. With the Loyalist fleet in full retreat, no one could stop the great Mongano-class bombardment cruisers and wallowing troop barges from closing with the Forge world, as Mezoa's orbital defenses were soon swept clear by the combined fire of the Alpha Legion and Iron Warriors. The final invasion of Mezoa had begun. High above Mezoa, their path now unimpeded, the bombardment cruisers and troop transports carrying the traitors moved into position, while on the ground, Battle Group Revenant, comprised of the recently disembarked shattered legionnaires from the Ebon Drake, gathered around their leader, Cassian Vaughn, former Legion commander of the Salamander's Legion in the days before the reunification with its Primarch Vulcan. Now, for those of you who have no idea who Cassian Vaughn was, let me give you a little background. And quite frankly, he's worth talking about. He's pretty awesome. Cassian Vaughn was known by many names. Cassian Dracos, the Fallen Master, the Twice Dead, and the Avatar of the Sacred Flame. He was the first Lord Commander of the 18th Legion, from the time it was founded on Terra during the Unification Wars, until the discovery of Primarch Vulcan on the world of Nocturne during the Great Crusade. Cassian was mortally wounded in a battle against the Orcs, but such was the esteem in which Vulcan held this warrior that he undertook to fashion for him a unique dreadnought sarcophagus known as the Dracos Revenant. It was forged of nigh impenetrable and unknown alloys said to come from deep beneath old Earth, that none save Vulcan was able to master and shape to his will. During the drop site massacre on Estevan V, Cassian fought with unmatched fury, first spearheading the attack against the enemy. Then, as the second wave showed their true colors as supporters of the traitorous War Master Horus, standing fast though all around him were slaughtered. Surviving where most of the Legion had perished, Cassian Vaughn gathered the survivors of the horrid betrayal of Estevan V, now calling them the Disciples of the Flames, boarded the strike cruiser Ebon Drake, and now shows up on the outskirts of the Mezoan Campaign. Now that you're all caught up to speed, Cassian Dracos led his Disciples of the Flame to Mezoa's central Forge Fane. There, the twice-dead former master of the 18th Legion met with the Norn regents of Mezoa, a triad of truly ancient Mechanicum Archmagi sisters, so interlinked by complex neural interface technology that for all intents and purposes, they formed a single entity which directed the vast domains of Mezoa. This historical meeting was immortalized by Mezoa's scribe adepts and still remains in the data archives of Mezoa 10,000 standard years later. The fire-blackened and battered armored sarcophagus of Cassian Dracos, the avatar of the sacred flame, confronting the deadly thin forms of the Norn regents, each one of the three magi suspended like spiders in the complex web of arcane cybernetic technology that allowed them to communicate and direct their thralls all across Mezoa. None could deny that the changed Cassian Dracos exerted some strange influence on every automata in his vicinity, for when he penetrated the Norn regent's throne room, even the regent's personal bodyguards, towering and powerful Damatar-class battle automata, fell back in halting steps. And who could say if the Norn regents themselves were not somehow influenced by Dracos' new aura? Now, if this sounds like Imperial propaganda, it's because it is. The meeting didn't quite go down this way. Let me explain. In actuality, Cassian Dracos entered the Norn regent's throne room. The protectors did fall back at the sight of him, yet the regents were not so impressed. It wasn't until Cassian spoke of his visions and the trials he had endured on Estevan V that the regent's interest was piqued. He spoke of his search for Vulcan and his conviction that the Primarch yet lived, and of the sacrifice of the 18th Legion. Cassian's tale of woe and sacrifice moved the cold mechanical hearts of the Norn regents, as the salamander's legendary tenacity somewhat echoed the path of the flame eternal, the strange schismatic creed of the cult Mechanicus, honored by both the Magi of Mezoa and the hierarchs of House Hermetica. However, these similarities in belief and common loyalty to the Emperor of Mankind seemed a rather slim basis for the accord that would be signed by Dracos and the Norn queens of Mezoa. In this agreement, Cassian Dracos was formally recognized as the living avatar of the machine god and given command over Mezoa's sizable Tagmata and its allies. For the dour tech adepts of the Mezoan Forge Fanes, the unexpected arrival of a prophet of the Omnissiah was marked as a sign for their impending victory. Imperial scholars in later millennia have often wondered at the sudden acceptance with which Dracos was met by different groups and factions he encountered. Some even suggest that this outcome might in some way be related to the ability bestowed by the warp, as Estevan V's position at the time of the Cassian Dracos' near death had it located at the heart of one of the fiercest warp storms in human record. Given the immense amount of bloodshed during the Dropsite Massacre, and its effects on the powers of the warp, who can say for sure that the baleful powers of the warp had not had more serious effect on the entombed dreadnought? Well, whatever the truth, this alliance would prove beneficial for both parties. Unable to deliver the products of its forges to those Imperial units prosecuting the Great Crusade as they were intended to, Mezoa's storage vaults harbored a true fortune in suits of power armor, weapons, ammunition, and armored vehicles to which the Disciple of the Flames and other loyal survivors were now given access to. In defiance of the ancient treaties negotiated with distant Mars and Terra, which regulated who and in what quantity someone might receive the labor of Mezoa's forges, Battle Group Revenant was entirely re-equipped with the very finest of Mezoa's creations. Where previously most of the Shattered Legionnaires could only rely on their own personal bolters and those few man-portable heavy weapons they had brought with them, the Disciples of the Flame and their allies now had access to a large stockpile of armored vehicles and personal carriers, including the advanced command version of the vulnerable Rhino STC, the Democles Commando Rhino, which had only recently been approved for construction and had as yet not been delivered to any of the Space Marine legions. The greatest gift of all was perhaps a handful of newly completed Glaive Super Heavy Special Weapon tanks, initially intended for the 9th Legion. Most notoriously, one of their number, the Dragon Eternal, crewed by Xiphus Jur's Disciple of the Flames, would defend the Septern Gateway, the Mezoa's principal forge fane, for more than 4 solar hours, after an Alpha Legion diversionary attack had drawn away the gate's other defenders. Attended by the most skilled of Mezoa's forge rite, the Iron Dragon withdrew to the deepest and most sacred fanes of Mezoa in order to receive the benedictions of the machine god that would mark his ascension as the head of the Mezoan Tagmata. The Archmagi were also confident that they would be able to restore Cassian Dracos to his former glory, allowing the newly appointed Avatar of the Sacred Flame to walk again upon the battlefield. While outside the traitors' dropships blackened the sky, it fell to Lieutenant Chaplain Xiphus Jur to lead the Disciples of the Flames in battle against the attackers. However, they would not face the enemy alone. With them stood members of the Iron Hands and Raven Guard legions who had traveled with them aboard the Ebon Drake, as well as 48 Astartes of the Imperial Fist, the survivors of the 7th Legion garrison on the Meneka Lux, whose flight had ended on Mezoa. Similarly, the 891st Leith cohort of the Solar Auxilia had also been drawn to the still resisting Forge World, and now stood ready to defend it against the closing Alpha Legion and Iron Warriors. Finally, Mezoa mustered its own defense forces in the form of the Mezoan Tagmata, battle automata, and diverse classes of models, all veterans of centuries of Xenos raids before their eradication in the Metu conglomerate. In total, it has been estimated that the defenders of Mezoa numbered close to 12,000 men under arms, including cybernetic monsters, towering battle automata, and soul-shorn Adasuria Exulii, and the Tagmata Mezoa, and several dozen knights of the House of Hermetica. Try saying that 3 times fast. For historians, such as myself, many of the great battles of the Horus Heresy are difficult to reconstitute. Too much data has been lost in the fires of that conflict, or through the slow erosion of time. Even more has been sequestered purposely by the authority of the Holy Ordos of the Inquisition, or following the edicts of the High Lords of Terra. It is fortunate that this is not the case for the Third Siege of Mezoa. Of these sources, the greatest wealth of information, ironically, comes from the War Chronicles of Nerek Dragur, the commander of the Iron Warriors' 114th Grand Battalion. Getting back to the start of the siege, although numbering in the thousands, the first wave of enemy dropships essentially carried pack conscripts from Moab and other Imperialis Auxilia troopers who had declared for the War Master. Both were considered inherently expendable by Legionis Astartes overlords, especially Aetolian Score, who commanded the Traitor Armada. No defense cannons or flights of slave Mechanicum drone interceptors met the incoming assault wave. Mezoa's guns remained eerily silent, as the Magi had decided to turn to far more dangerous weapons. The wrath of Mezoa itself. Set deep beneath the stable crust of Mezoa's outer mantle, great subduction furnaces were used to hurl vast projectiles of magma and bedrock into the skies, each projectile easily measuring a kilometer in length. Against this weapon, the traitor gunships and dropcraft stood no chance, and the casualties proved devastating. These few dropships that did manage to safely land on the ash-covered surface were eagerly awaited by packs of vicious Virax-class battle automata. Their power blades massacred the isolated traitors and chased the scattered survivors into caves of sulfurous crevices of Mezoa's mantle, where they would slowly choke to death, brought low by the heat, ash, and toxic gases released by Mezoa's intense volcanic activity. Of the traitor invasion's first assault wave, none survived. But unfortunately for the Loyalists, its intent was never to establish a proper beachhead, but provide such an aggressive response. Aetolian Score had correctly assumed that the Mezoan Magi would not be able to constantly maintain an exotic bombardment that had annihilated the first assault wave, unless they wanted to entirely destroy the world or dangerously compromise the tectonic stability. The barrage would have to relent at some point. The massacre of the traitor's first assault wave had achieved just that. Loath to squander his own troops in a bloody affair that was a planetary drop, Score placed the 114th Grand Battalion at the heart of his second assault wave, supplementing what battle-hardened mortal troops remained. Encountering only conventional anti-air fire, the second assault wave suffered only minimal losses until it reached the volcanic ash-shrouded surface of the defiant Forge world. Amidst the scarred corpses and burnt-out wrecks of the first wave, a message reached Dragur and his grim ironclad veterans. It was a message from Aetolian Score, informing them that each vessel trying to leave the surface in retreat would be shot down by the Alpha Legion's guns. Now, with no other option save victory, the Iron Warriors and the Auxiliaries dug in, transforming their dropships into makeshift bastions, which would anchor their defensive lines. Soon the Loyalists rushed in, ready to chase the traitors off the world. Under a hellish glow produced by great magma geysers that illuminated the battlefield, the Iron Warriors fought with a ferocity unmatched, save perhaps by those legionnaires that followed the bloody path of the 12th Legion, those of Angron's ilk, the World Eaters. Each Iron Warrior that fell killed at least 3 attackers in return, and the 114th Grand Battalion demanding a steep price for every Terran inch of ground captured by the Loyalists. At the battle's climax, Nerk Dragur faced the commander of the Loyalist detachment, the Imperial Fist swordsman and champion Voltus Moran, and slew him. His cortex-controlled battle automata tearing Morian's corpse to shreds, leaving the Loyalists to quit the field. At the end of the first solar day, the sacrifices of the Iron Warriors had secured a landing zone for the traitor armada. The first victory would go to the traitors. The ash plains at the edge of the great forge fanes of Mezoa were swarming with activity. Sokar-patterned stormbirds, amongst the heaviest vessels that were able to land safely on Mezoa's fragile surface, formed great bastions of overlapping void shields, their combined power great enough to repel the ground-shaking impacts of lava-coated bedrock flung against them. Soon both sides were firmly entrenched and facing each other over a short span of no man's land. Using their superior numbers, the traitors tried to push the attack home, their artillery trains targeting the Forge Fane's fortifications, creating breaches where a Tulian score mercilessly ordered the massed mortal Auxilia to attack. Wherever the strength of the enemy seemed too much for mortal or mechanicum soldiers to overcome, the score dispatched the 114th Grand Battalion, keeping his own Alpha Legion Astartes in reserve, shielding them from attrition wherever he could. While the Iron Warriors suffered mounting casualties, the Alpha Legion used the distraction caused by their allies to act as headhunters and raiders, targeting isolated Loyalist command units or sensitive installations, and then retreating to their lines before counterattack could be mounted. Now, once again, I must say, Tulian Score makes this mistake over and over and over again, using the 114th Grand Battalion as just expendable. He never actually uses them as an asset, which eventually does catch up with him. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself. Where was I? Yes. This did not mean that the Loyalists were content to sit idle while Score prosecuted his assault. The defense of the walls and fortifications fell to Mezoa's own Tagmata forces, and the heavy infantry of the Leith Solar Auxiliary cohorts, thus freeing the Legiones Astarte contingent for more dangerous tasks. Reinforced by the remaining elements of the Imperial Fist, Xiphus Ajur split his Disciples of the Flames into demi-companies of about 50 Astartes. These detachments conducted a series of spoiling attacks and lightning raids intended to disrupt the enemy's efforts. The Mezoan Magi supported their limited forays into enemy-held territory, isolating enemy troops concentrated by letting entire regions of the Ash Plains collapse, burying the traitors under a tidal wave of fiery lava, or collapsing the enemy trenches upon them. The disorganized and isolated pockets of resistance were then cleansed by the Loyalist Astartes. Everywhere on the battlefield, the Tech Adepts resolved to use suicide cohorts of Adisculii Auxiliae and battle automata to ensure the enemy into pre-planned kill zones where great blasts of magma would annihilate friend and foe alike. As with all things, the Mechanicum Adepts of Mezoa kept detailed records of their expenditures during the battle. Traitor and Loyalist casualties were compiled and run through mathematical simulations that would determine the Forge World's best response to the ever-changing tactical situation. Despite the small victories and the Loyalist mastery of the terrain, the cold arithmetic of the war did not favor Mezoa. For 9 long solar days, Attilian Score led the traitor host in an unrelenting siege of Mezoa's great forge fanes and their spired halls. In high orbit, the Mongonol-class bombardment cruisers rained down clusters of kinetic munition, to which the Mezoan Tech Adepts responded by hurling the white-hot burning blood of Mezoa itself into space. Entire chunks of the planet's mantle were blown into lower orbit, causing small artificial created meteor showers to rain down on the tortured landscape beneath. Venting scalding clouds of ash and steam, the rage of Mezoa's lifeblood cleansed entire battlefields of traitors, while fresh tides of magma burned armored colonies beneath them, dooming them to a fiery grave. To those that followed Attilian Score, it must have seemed as if they had penetrated a living rendition of the mythological hell of Old Terra. Meanwhile, safely entrenched behind the armored walls of Mezoa's principal forge fane, Xiphus Jur contemplated the battlefield and bore witness to the slow erosion of the Forge world's outer defenses. Isolated as they were by the expansion of Horus's shadow empire, hopes of loyalist reinforcements reaching Mezoa was non-existent. In truth, they remained little hope at all. Cassian Dracos, the true leader of the Disciples of Flame, had yet to resurface from his isolation. Despite the losses inflicted to the War Master's lackeys, the enemy still heavily outnumbered the Mezoan defenders. Regardless of this inescapable logic of their defeat, the loyalists of Mezoa had no intention of surrendering. The Northern regents had decreed that Mezoa would not bow to the invaders, and that as long as a single battle automata still functioned, Mezoa would not fall. The Astartes, especially those of the Salamanders, were paragons of stoicism, determined to bleed the enemy for every inch of ground they took. This grim resolve in their hearts, the loyalists met each traitor assault with stubborn resistance. While defeat might be inevitable, Jur and the others, like him, would ensure that Horus's armies were denied a swift and effortless victory. The defenders' tenacity did not pass unnoticed, and it is said to have angered Aetolian Score to no end. Like all ambitious military leaders under the War Master's banner, Score yearned to fight at the forefront of Horus's Dark Crusade, and eventually stand beside him for the climactic Battle of Terra. To tarry here on Mezoa would only serve to incite the War Master's displeasure, and see Score relegated to less glorious battlefields. Thus, Aetolian Score could not afford to sit idle. Mezoa had to fall, and it had to fall quickly. In order to ensure victory, Score began plotting a single decisive attack that would seal the defender's fate and secure him a return to the favor of both the War Master and his own inscrutable Genesire. This was his second mistake. If he had consulted Dragor, he would have learned that sieges take time. If he had thought of the Iron Warriors as a key pieces on the battlefield instead of expendable meat for the grinder, he probably would have eventually won. But alas, Score had become a fool in his ambition, and pride would not allow him to take counsel. What remained of the 114th Grand Battalion of the 4th Legion was committed en masse to a frontal assault on one of Mezoa's walls, a key defense bastion designated as Tertial-05, which protected the approach to the main forge spires. Despite the formal protests of the Iron Warriors Consul Prevayan, Narek Dragor, the attack was launched according to Score's plan, though the Iron Warriors only agreed to this on the assurance that Score and the Alpha Legion would support the attack. Now, I have to say anyways, Narek here is being very ignorant of Score, but I digress. With the characteristic violence of the 4th Legion's assault, the Iron Warriors struck the defense of Tertial-05 like a hammer blow. Wave after wave of gunmetal gray-armored Astartes advanced into heavy fire, heedless to the losses the Loyalists inflicted on them. Dragor's attack quickly drew in defenders from other sectors of the walls, as even Tertial-05's mighty defenses were unable to stop the advance of the 114th Grand Battalion. However, with steady reinforcements, the Loyalists stopped the retreat and slowly brought the Iron Warriors to a halt. Bogged down in the outer defense of Tertial-05, surrounded by Loyalist units and caught in murderous crossfire, Dragor ordered his men to dig in and set up makeshift defenses within the captured positions they now occupied. Wherever the Loyalists threatened to break through, Dragor sent his cohort of battle automata. As the traitor casualties began to rise, Dragor sent a predetermined Vox signal, later retrieved and deciphered by the Mezoan Magi, to the Alpha Legion, calling them to launch the second assault. But the traitor Vox network remained eerily silent. As we all know, uncaring of the Iron Warriors' fate, Aetolian Score and his elite Legion headhunter cohorts were already conducting their own assault on the Mezoan Forge, with a majority of the defenders and all its legionaries drawn away to engage the Iron Warriors. His own forces, still relatively fresh, Score and the Alpha Legion infiltrators only encountered depleted battle automata, maniples, which they quickly overwhelmed. Now, this is Attilian's third and final mistake. If he had let the Iron Warriors of the 118th Battalion know that they were a misdirection, so Score could sneak in the back and exterminate the heads of the automata, perhaps there would have been stiffer resistance of the Iron Warriors. I am sorry. I seem to be getting ahead of it myself. But let us continue with Score, shall we? Soon the infiltrators were nearing the main spindle spires of the forge, where in the central chamber resided the Norn regents themselves. Only the regent's own bodyguard, a few dozen Domitar-class battle automata, now stood between Score and his main objective. While each was a fearsome engine of war, and one of the finest creations of the Mezoan Mechanicum, they could not hold out for long against the skill and sheer number of the traitor marines they now faced. Fortunate for the defenders, Mezoa's central halls also harbored a 50 Astartes-strong honor guard of the Disciples of the Flames. These space marines awaited the return of their lord, Cassian Dracos, who was still sealed within the Forge Fane's inner sanctum. They had received strict orders from Dracos to guard the vaults, sparing no legionaries for the battle raging, but a short distance away. Led by the former Raven Guard veteran Electo Carhane, some disciples chose to disobey their orders and join the defense of the Norn regents. With these unexpected reinforcements, the Domitar-class battle automata and the Space Marines were able to hold the line outside the chambers of the Norn queens, enabling the horde of multi-limbed servitors to evacuate Mezoa's supreme rulers. Yet, despite this heroic effort, Attilian Score and his personal guard were able to penetrate the hall. With las cutters and melta-guns, they set about hacking the sole remaining Norn regent free of the intricate neural webway linking her to Mezoa's defenses. Once she was cut free, Score executed her. With the death of one of their ancient tech magi, utter chaos erupted amongst the Mechanicum defenders of Mezoa. All across the battlefield, battle automatas either collapsed or entered a staged berserk and fractural fury, tearing each other or their enemies apart. Sentient units like the Scatari or the Thalax cohorts found themselves cut off from all external direction, focusing on the fight at hand. Sensing the defenders' distress, traitor units surged forward to attack all across the war zone. Only at Tertial-05, where the Leith Solar Auxilia and the Disciples of Flame kept the Iron Warriors pinned down in a murderous crossfire, was the enemy kept in check. It seemed that the end had finally arrived. Yet, it was at this moment that the doors to the inner vaults opened, and Cassian Dracos emerged from his seclusion in the fabrication vaults, his ancient dreadnought chassis restored to its former glory by the arts of the Mezoan Forge race. Yet rather than lend his strength against Attilian's Score and his Alpha Legion warriors ransacking the central spires of Mezoa, Dracos led his honor guard towards Tertial-05 and the Iron Warriors. As the dreadnought charged forth, those automata he passed shook off whatever feedback-induced mania had befallen their cortex and gathered around the Iron Dragon, now slave to Dracos' indomitable will. By the time Dracos reached the shell-scarred battlefield of Tertial-05, it was the head of nearly 1,000 battle automata. Yet, rather than leading a decisive charge against the remaining Iron Warriors, now entrenched in a formidable makeshift fortress of broken rockcrete and iron, Dracos approached alone, calling upon the enemy commander to show himself. Heedless of any danger, Dracos passed through the ranks of the Iron Warriors' own battle automata, the robots refusing to follow Dragor's orders to engage the dreadnought, while Narek Dragor stood tall upon the fortifications his brothers had built. Dracos remained below. What words the two leaders exchanged remains largely unknown, but the prophecies of the Flames record that whosoever has found the craft of the forge, the avatar of our Lord Vulcan, has power, even in the flesh of the enemies, where it has felt the touch of the forge. So he turned the foe to cause of righteousness. Now, even in private journals of Consul Prevan Dragor, they do not mention this incident. In truth, after that day, he had no more private recordings and eschewed all company save that of Dracos and his automata. What is known is that when the two met, they exchanged few words, and Dragor turned to address his men, and he said,
"Brothers, once more an oath to us stands broken. The Alpha Legion has abandoned us once again. Now we shall show that we do not renege on our vows. The death of Stranover and Mezoa both call for vengeance, and we shall grant it to them."
Almost silently, the Iron Warriors of the 114th Grand Battalion reloaded their bolters and followed the towering form of the ancient Orgol, a Doredo-patterned dreadnought, towards Mezoa's central spires where their quarry lurked. Still believing victory lay within his grasp, the dark blood oil mix of the slain Norn regent wet on his master-crafted power axe, Autelian Score remained blissfully unaware of the Iron Warrior's change of allegiance. Yeah, but he soon discovered that he was trapped at the heart of the resistant Forge Fane. Slowly but steadily, the two remaining Norn queens wrestled back control over their cohorts of battle automata as a solid wall of Legioness Astartes power armor rushed across the open ground, those vengeful survivors of the 114th Grand Battalion at their head. Soon Score's Voxspeed was alive with panicked news that armored columns of solar auxilia were attacking his landing zones, while in orbit the Loyalist vessels had emerged from hiding places and were now attacking the dispersed traitor fleet. Focused on bombarding the Forge worlds below, Score's warships were not expecting such a sudden assault, and their losses would likely be severe. Knowing his daring gamble had failed, Autelian Score hefted his weapons and ordered his men to fight through the onrushing Loyalists. His personal bodyguard and herald, Ancient Nihilin, led the assault. Score and his men would eventually break through. The Contemptor-patterned dreadnought, Nihilin, locked in deadly combat with Cassian Dracos himself, whilst Score was badly wounded by a hit and a loss of his arm by Zaphius Jur's Power Cruises. With their forces in disarray and their leader wounded, the traitors soon abandoned the surface and retreated to their void ships. Thus, the third siege of Mezoa was over. Although the enemy troops still numbered in their thousands, the remaining cohorts of the Impandixed Tagmata, now leaderless, were crushed in a matter of solar hours. The first to abandon their allies and flee the surface of Mezoa were the forces belonging to the 78th chapter of the Alpha Legion, a fact that permitted them to escape with the least casualties. While the traitors initially succeeded in maintaining orbital superiority, high-speed passes and raids by Loyalist vessels, such as the Ebon Drake, and new salvos of projectiles torn from Mezoa's fiery heart soon forced the traitor fleets to retreat to the outer system, and eventually leave Mezoan space entirely to the Loyalist. Though unconquered and still defiant, the damage dealt to Mezoa's infrastructure by the traitors' assault was great. The Forge Fanes were so damaged that it would take the Tech Adepts many standard years to reconstitute their former strength, and for the Mezoan Tagmata and the House Hermetica to recover from their losses. Furthermore, the death of one of the Norn regents caused much strife within the Mezoan Tech priesthood, as the different orders within the Forge struggled to fill the void left by her death. Cassian Dracos' status was also an enigma. While some lauded over him as the savior of Mezoa, others mistrusted him because of the strange orders he gave during the siege and the unnatural authority and influence he had displayed over the creations of the Mechanicum. Still determined to take the fight to the traitors, Cassian Dracos led numerous raids into traitor-held territory, actions which only served to cement his reputation and fuel the cult of the personality that sprang up around him. The result was a gradual increase in the number of the disciples of the Flames. While the leader of the 114th Grand Battalion, Narek Dragor, became a close confidant to the Iron Dragon, rarely seen without his new master, many records indicate that several Iron Warriors, most of them vocal opponents of Dragor, mysteriously vanished after the Loyalist victory, although neither Dragor himself nor Dracos officially ordered the ranks of the 114th to be purged. While Mezoa was unable to reach out to other beleaguered Loyalist star systems, the Defiant Forge world remained a thorn in the War Master Horus's side for the duration of the heresy. With the traitor blockade broken, Mezoa became a safe haven for those who had successfully escaped or avoided the clutches of the Sons of Horus and their traitorous allies. Several independent companies of Legiones Astartes, the most prominent of them the Disciples of the Flames, used Mezoa as a base for their own war of vengeance upon the traitors from behind the enemy lines. While limited in scope, it was the actions of these isolated loyalist companies and others that would buy the Imperium valuable time to reinforce its defenses and prepare for the traitors' attack upon the heart of the Emperor's realm. So in conclusion, one might ask what happened to our three leaders, Aetolian Score, Cassian Dracos, and Nerk Dragur. Well, as stated before, Dracos began a career as acting warlord of the Disciples of the Flame, with Nerk Dragur as his right hand. Following this initial success, Cassian Dracos would lead several bloody raids against the traitor-held star systems, further weakening Horus's grip in the region of space. What became of Cassian Dracos remains unknown, yet the Salamander chapter has continued over the millennia to have fallen battle brothers entered into the ancient sarcophagus. So one could assume that he is dead. As to the other two, Nerik's tale ends with Dracos going off as his right-hand man. What became of him after the heresy remains a mystery. Yet, it wouldn't surprise me if he and those that remained of the 114th continued to support the Disciples of the Flame, and he ended up on Nocturne. Due to his character, I would imagine he would continue on fighting against the traitor legions during the Great Scouring, until he met his ultimate doom. Aetolian Score also disappears from the records, yet his fate, I believe, is far more straightforward. Having failed the War Master yet again, I doubt he lasted to the end of the heresy. More than likely, he was eliminated by one of his own men, his death ordered by Alpharius or even Horus. It also wouldn't surprise me if he caught a bullet from the Alpha Legion's assassin, Exodus. Yeah, this is all conjecture. Well, folks, I think that's about it. I think we covered everything. If you enjoyed this bonus box, please like, subscribe, comment, and follow.
And as always, until next time, this is Zeckthar, signing off.